Here is a cast of colourful characters. As you know, Derek Arden, our member from England, introduced me for the Godfrey, and now we are very good friends. And last year, he took me from the airport. We went straight to Cove Castle and we had lunch with Godfrey and another character. We are holding up his book, who is a good friend of Godfrey's and has a role in this story. And that is Damien Lewis, who is a best-selling author. And I believe his story that was turned into a movie, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, was the best movie I saw last year. Now, we are going to talk about British maritime history, swashbuckling stories of the Thomas Hardy School. Godfrey Lancashire has enjoyed a very successful business career. He was very well known in banking, which is where he got pally with Derek Arden. He founded a private investigation firm that grew to 45 locations. Their specialty was complex fraud cases. As interesting as that is, we will not hear anything about his career. Godfrey is now a dedicated historian and mentor. We are about to hear a story of survival and inspiration. Godfrey, along with his friend and best-selling author Damien Lewis, have worked tirelessly to preserve the great oak screen. This story is one of determination, resilience, and the enduring power of our connections to the past. Please welcome one of my favorite travel guides when I'm in Dorset. So I will be running, Tony, the PowerPoint. So please welcome Godfrey Lancashire. Applause, applause, applause.
Thank you very much, Patricia. That was some introduction, and so sorry about the time difference, but I am awake. You may not be over there, but I'm delighted to be with you. Just to tell you, speaking today from the UK where I am, it's 4 degrees. It's quite a nice day, but it's still a bit chilly. I bet it's a bit warmer where you all are. But thank you all for joining. And I am going to tell you a little bit about this wonderful piece of English history, which overlaps actually into American history as well. Carl mentioned that. It's lovely to see some friends that I already have met and have got to know on various breakfast meetings. And here we are. So, Patricia, thank you for doing the honors with the slides. And I want to first of all take you back in time. So, a little bit of time travel. Use your imagination if you would. And I'm taking you back to the first great Elizabethan period. Elizabeth I is on the throne. She was a wonderful monarch. She brought a bit of stability after huge unrest. And you will all know the stories of Henry VIII and so on, but we're now into a bit of stability. She came to the throne in 1558, so our story goes back well over 450 years. And she ruled for about 40 years. Um, she was a wonderful character. She was very well read. She could speak and write in Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Spanish. It was a time of great adventure. You can remember those guys that you'll have heard of, Walter Raleigh, Sir Francis Drake. There were naval battles. Piracy was a noble profession. More of that in a minute. It was, as Patricia said, and it's a wonderful word. I love to get my mouth around this. It was a time of great swashbuckling. And we'll all say that again, swashbuckling. Wonderful. It was a time of expansion and adventure. But Elizabeth was also a great advocate of education. We were coming out into a golden age of the arts, literature. There was William Shakespeare. And you may not know this, but there were over 40 schools founded then in the name of Queen Elizabeth. Um, they were to be grammar schools. And she also founded some great universities, Jesus College, Oxford, Trinity College in Dublin. So she was well read, well respected, a great advocate of education. She'd been on the throne about 10 years when into the picture comes our hero, the great personality of this story, a man known as Squire Hardy from a village of Frampton in Dorset in southwest England. And a squire was a gentleman, interesting because he made his money through piracy. And he was allowed, with the blessing of the monarch, to go off and bash up the Spanish and the French and capture ships and loot, and he made his money. So our hero, Hardy of Frampton, and Hardy is a Dorset name. There are at least three renowned, worldwide known persons of the name of Hardy, and we'll come to those in a minute. But our main character is Squire Hardy, Thomas Hardy from Frampton. So the first slide you can see there, the map of the UK, for those of you not particularly familiar, but right down at the bottom on the south coast, you can see a little circle and the village of Frampton. So we're right down near the south of England. In the west, you can just make out Plymouth, that great naval city, and the English Channel, of course, dividing us from those Frenchies across the water. So that's where our story takes place. So, Patricia, the next slide, I think, please. And now we're focusing in a little bit more. So, just in the top left of this picture, you can see the little village of Frampton, which is about 4 miles to the northwest of Dorchester. And Dorchester is the county town of the county of Dorset. And here I must pause, and you must all understand that your president, Patricia, was born and grew up in this wonderful county of Dorset, just as I was. So we've got little village of Frampton, we've got the county town of Dorchester, which was originally Iron Age, and then when Vespasian came over in about 40 AD, he and his Romans bashed up the locals, and Dorchester became a very well-known Roman town, a walled town. It was known as Dernaveria, and it was the gateway for the Romans to the west, on to Exeter and so on. Very important town, and the county town still today. About 8 miles south of Dorchester, you can see Weymouth. And Weymouth had an advantage of having a very deep, very natural, very protected anchorage. And that's important for our story. Same is true today. It's a seaside holiday resort, but it does have this fabulous harbour. So those are the main places we need to focus on: Frampton, Dorchester, and Weymouth. So, Patricia, the next, please. Squire Hardy made his money, as I said, through piracy, and he built and owned various properties in and around Weymouth and Dorchester. But as he was nearing the end of his life, he gave a huge chunk of his loot to found a school, the Thomas Hardy School. And that picture you can see there is a very current picture, only taken a very few days ago. And it is the original school building. Remember, this is well over 450 years old. It's still standing today, no longer a school, of course, but there it is in the main street of Dorchester, the county town. Today, it's uh, a little arcade of coffee shops, little boutiques, and so on. But the exterior of that building is still there. And at the beginning, there were about 20 boys, and it was called a free school. They didn't have to pay for their education. And it's the forerunner of one of our famous grammar schools. which we'll talk about in a minute. So, Patricia, the next one, please. And here we are. This is a passageway that goes right through the middle of that old school building, and you can see the nature of the stone, and it goes from one main street today right through to another street at the other side in the town of Dorchester. Okay, Patricia. Thank you. And here again, some of the intricate carving on the walls of that school building. So this was all as a result of the pirate's money, Squire Hardy of Brampton. The next, Patricia, thank you. And again, we can see this is the main street. This is today. This is absolutely current. The outside of the building, it's got a very well-known clock now, and you can see it, but that is as it would have been over 450 years ago. So it's recorded in the school history. We move on a little bit, but in July of 1588, the boys of that school, there were now about 40 by this stage, were given a half-day holiday to go up onto the hills between Dorchester and Weymouth. You remember the geography, Weymouth, that seaside town just below Dorchester. So they would have walked about 3 or 4 miles to the top of these hills overlooking Weymouth. And the reason they were given a holiday was to watch the great Spanish Armada sail by. So there were 130 galleons in this great fleet, the Spanish fleet that was hoping to come and bash us Brits up. And they didn't succeed, of course, but the school recorded and they gave the boys a holiday to go and watch. And Patricia the next. And here we come to the great galleon, one of 130 in that armada, and this is the San Salvador. And we'll mention a little bit more about the American connection later on, that the San Salvador was a prized ship in that Spanish armada. It carried some treasury. But as you will know from your history, some of the ships floundered in a storm, but the San Salvador had an even worse fate. There was an explosion in its armaments magazine. Nobody quite knows how that occurred, whether it was a cannonball from the Brits or whether it was a spark, but there was a big explosion and 49 of their crew perished as a result of the explosion. The rest of them jumped overboard, and the English Navy sent another very famous ship, the Golden Hind, to put ropes onto the San Salvador, and they towed it back into Weymouth Harbour. Remember that wonderful deep anchorage? So they towed it back into Weymouth Harbour, and the English Navy then, of course, went on board and took whatever it wanted. It took all the bullion it could find, all the probably the best pieces. Then the locals were allowed to pile in. And we know that there were various wine jugs, glassware was taken. A lot of that is on display in a local museum. But our mate, Thomas Hardy, pirate, with his mate, he piled on board and took away a lot of the ship's oak timbers. And I think we have a look at the next one. Thanks. Thanks, Patricia. And here we have the first real image of the great oak screen, Elizabethan, dating at least to 1588, probably earlier. But this is the screen made from those timbers from the San Salvador. It's an impressive screen. It's 6 meters by 4 meters. So it's big. And you can just see, those of you who are as old as me may remember the desks, those school desks. And this picture comes from that original school building that I've just shown you in the main street of Dorchester. And it was installed by the then headmaster, a Dr. Robert Cheek. in 1618. So there are a few years where it's probably been in store, but we definitely know it came from the San Salvador. We definitely know it went into the school building in 1618. So it's been in the school's possession for well over 400 years. So it stayed in that building for over 300 years until, of course, the school was expanding. There were more boys, there were more activities, they wanted playing fields and so on. So we moved, Patricia, next slide. And it moved in 1927. So for over 300 years, it was in that first building, and now it moves to the new school in 1927. And not in 1927, but I actually went to this school at this building in the 50s and 60s. And Damien, who's a little bit younger than me, he also went to school in this school building a little after that. But that's where the screen went. And when I was at school, I remember it being in the school library. Next slide, Patricia. So the second of our famous Hardys, you may recognize this chap, but this is Thomas Hardy, poet and author. And the reason I'm showing him is he laid the foundation stone of that building you've just seen in 1927. He actually died quite soon after, 1928, 29, I think. But in 1927, he laid the foundation stone of that school building. And interestingly, doing our research, we discovered that he had been elected in that year as a vice president of the Old Hardians. That's the alumni of the Thomas Hardy School. And this is where I can be a big headed. Damien and I have both been elected president. Thomas Hardy was only vice president, but we have something in common. So that's the famous author, Tess of the d'Urbervilles, Far from the Madding Crowd, Mayor of Casterbridge, Jude the Obscure, and so on and so on. So he was an architect to start with, and actually he practiced in that main street of Dorchester that I showed you, opposite the school, really, and then went on to become better known as an author, writer, playwright, poet, and so on. So we had 300 years of the screen in one building. Then the screen moved in 1927, and it was there for over 60 years until it moved again, Tricia, to the current school site. So it was 60 years, and then it moved here in about 1992. And this is as it is today, an aerial view of the current school. You can see it's grown a little bit since the first building in South Street. And it's a wonderful school with a wonderful range of facilities. It now has 2,200 students aged between 13 and 18. It has the largest sixth form in the UK, over 800 students in the sixth form. It's totally inclusive of all abilities. Uh, it's a state school, so it's free. Um, it's got a big section for those with special needs. So totally inclusive, wonderful sports facilities, music, the arts, academic, and it's rated good by our inspectorate, Ofsted, in the UK. So it's really good. And the screen moved from the library of the former building to being on display above the stage of the theatre in this campus. And so far, so good. It was appreciated by everybody. Everybody knew what it was. But then the governors needed to refurbish the theatre. Okay. They had to take the screen down. And it was so heavy, they had to take it into sections and they put it into stall. And this is where there was a tragedy. The theatre was refurbished, and the mechanical engineers said it's too heavy to go back up, and it got a little bit forgotten. And an absolute tragedy, human error, not criminal, no money changed hands, but somebody sent it for scrap. to a scrapyard a few miles away from school, where it was in hundreds and hundreds of pieces. But the owner of the scrapyard, quite a cunning bloke, recognized that it was probably a little bit more valuable than firewood. So he put it on a special auction site for salvage. And a great character who's become a firm friend of mine saw it and got in touch with me, explained he thought he knew what it was. He went all the way down from up country in England and bought it for a few £100 and said, "Would you like it?" And it cost us a few £1,000s. But we did buy it on the basis that this chap, a very well-known conservator, Sam Harwood Bowles, would engage with us in restoring this screen to its former glory. So next, Patricia, please. So here we have some of the many hundreds and hundreds of little pieces of the screen, original nails, bolts, and so on, which was spread out like the most giant jigsaw across a floor that we had prior to putting it all back together. So again, Patricia. And this hall, where it is today, actually, and we'll come back to that, is an empty commercial space owned by the Duchy of Cornwall. And the Duchy of Cornwall was, until quite recently, Prince Charles, the heir to the throne, takes on this great title, Duchy of Cornwall. And the duchy owns huge estates, buildings, farms, tenanted properties, and so on. And of course, it was Prince Charles, now King Charles, and the Duke of Cornwall is now Prince William. The duchy have been very kind to work with us, and until this space might be tenanted by somebody down the line, we've been able to use it and keep the screen here free of charge, which is wonderfully kind from the duchy and also great for us. So you can see we've been able to spread it out and lay it out. Okay, Patricia. Thanks. Here we are, just more pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. And again, thank you. And these are some of the bases of the great columns, which I'll show you in a minute. But you can see the size of the whole thing starting to come together. Okay, thank you, Patricia. And on the right, we've got Sam Harwood Bowles, and on the left, his assistant, Lewis. Sam Harwood Bowles is really expert in this type of historic conservatory work. He's worked on Woburn Abbey, on many London historic buildings, but he had the skills to reassemble and resurrect it, and also look after it, treat it for rot and worm. It had been left outside under a tarpaulin for far too long, but we've now got the right temperature and so on. And again, Patricia, thank you. And so here it is, finally assembled. And there is Sam, and you can see now the scale. I said it was 6 meters by 4 meters, and you can start to see the size of this wonderful great oak screen. Now, deliberate questions, spot the deliberate. There are 2 doors, one isn't there, but we have it. The other door where Sam is standing is actually in reception in the main school building as a link to this wonderful piece of school history. So we do have the other door, and we're debating at the moment whether to reunite it with the screen or actually leave it in the school as a reminder and put some of the historical data in the gap. But there it is, we have it all. The other really fun thing to note is that there are 2 doors. And why are there 2 doors? Well, that's part of naval architecture. So, Patricia, can we move on? I think we've got the San Salvador coming on. Here we are. So, where did this come from? Well, It came from, you see the big central mast, the great tall mast in the middle, and just to the right of it, um, the timbers would have come from the width of the ship. It's known as leading into the aftercastle. So at the stern of the ship would have been all the sleeping quarters for the officers, the admiral, captain, and so on. And these timbers come from the width of the ship leading into those quarters. And the reason there were two doors, and it's true today in very modern naval ships, there was always a door for the captain or admiral, and then there was another door for all the rest of the other officers. So that's why there were two doors, still true today. So there we are, right back to the beginning, really, and the San Salvador, where this wonderful artifact originated from, then into school for over 400 years, and we've managed to salvage it, restore it, and put it back together. And we are now talking to Weymouth Museum quite seriously. They're very interested in the maritime history. So we are hoping that it will go into Weymouth Museum where everybody can see it for years and years to come. So that is the story of the great oak screen, Elizabethan oak screen from 1588. Before I hand back to Patricia, the other thing just to say is that we do know, and I think Carl may be aware of this, that in 1542, so before the Spanish Armada, the San Salvador was in Mexico and it sailed from Mexico to found San Diego. And although the historical records show that San Diego was probably settled much later, the first landfall and the first people to set foot in that area were the people from the San Salvador in 1542. So there's another piece of history which you can research as well as us. But there we are, the Great Oak Screen. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you. And if I remember the story correctly, you have been on a mission to find the right place to preserve it and share it. And that has not been very easy. So, can you tell
Been,
us all the places you tried to put
well,
it on
well,
display?
you're right. The first thing was we wanted it, if at all possible, to go back into school. But there was nowhere big enough. We looked, and the headmaster gave us carte blanche. He said, if you can find anywhere, we'll do it. But there isn't anywhere. We could have put it on an outside wall, but of course, weather and risk of damage and so on was too great. So we then had to look for an alternative. We wanted it to be on easy public display. So a museum was clearly the best answer. Dorchester Museum, for whatever reason, declined our offer, which was a shame. But Weymouth Museum are still very, very keen because of the maritime history. And we're very hopeful that that will happen later this year.
Good. Now, when I come home in June, what will I be able to be shown by you and Darren?
Well, I have the key to that wonderful building where it is at the moment, and our first stop will be to go into that building, and I can show you the screen. You can have your photograph taken with the screen, and then we'll go and have a coffee in that square in Poundbury, which, of course, was King Charles Square that he built.
Will you tell our audience a little bit about Poundbury?
Yes, it's Poundbury,
Bury,
B-U-R-Y.
Bury.
Poundbury is an extension of the town of Dorchester, and it was conceived and built by Prince Charles as a village, really, of mixed architecture, minimal cars, mixed shops where people could walk around. And he wanted to create this little town now, um, which was his baby. And he's developed it. It should be completely finished in the next couple of years. It's almost finished. And you like it or you don't like it. I love it, actually. I think it's great. And it does do what he wanted it to do. You can walk around everywhere, lots of shops, hotels, pubs, um, very little traffic, free parking, and it's a lovely little concept, which actually, Patricia, he's now developed another one down in Cornwall near Newquay, similar concept. And of course, it's not only providing housing, but it's providing the jobs that go with it.
Is it unusual for the king to give you free rent?
Yes, but currently, of course, it's his son because it's remember it's the Duchy of
Yeah.
Cornwall. Very unusual. We're very lucky.
Right.
It's a
And
mark. It's
yeah.
a mark of the history.
Mm. And at what point in your work was there a time that you ever shook your head and said, this isn't going to happen? I cannot believe people are not taking this seriously.
Well, of course, the first real shot, and I haven't shown it, but I have a photograph of it in this timber yard, this salvage
Mm.
yard, in hundreds of pieces, higgledy-piggledy, all over the place, about to be burnt or sold.
Yeah.
And that was just, oh, what a horror.
Mm.
Then we got on board, we formed a little committee, we raised some money, we did everything we could. And the next challenge is, you're quite right, is where it can be housed. And I couldn't believe how the local museum weren't interested enough to take it.
Mm. Good. All right. Well, Carl Walsh has his hand up and has a question for you.
I do. Godfrey, have you approached, since you have a relic of the very famous Spanish Armada there, have you approached the British Museum or the Maritime Museum in Greenwich?
We've been in touch with the people in Portsmouth who raised the other great ship, the Mary Rose,
Ah,
you may have heard of,
yes,
uh, dating from King Henry VIII's time. And a lot of the materials on our oak screen are of equal historic importance to the Mary Rose. Clearly, it's not
yes,
nearly as big, but we've tested the nails. They're from the same period. We've done the saltwater testing, and one thing we've been able to do, of course, which is fascinating, is we're now able to look round back of the screen, whereas previously it was always on a wall or in the library or wherever. We're now able to look at the back. And amazingly, there's so much history there. We've actually got a copy of the London Times advertising the French Revolution as it's happening, and that's on the back of the screen. So we have all this wonderful, wonderful history and graffiti and so on. But to answer your question, we have spoken to London museums, but actually, we don't want it to go to a London museum. It's a Dorset bit of history, it's South Coast, it's connected to the school. We want it to stay in the South and connected to school.
Good. Gordon Hill and then Janelle Barlow.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you for this wonderful program. When I read the announcement, a question jumped into my mind immediately. It's a little off topic, but when the Spanish Armada was a threat, I remember reading that the English set up a coast watch with bonfires and what have you, and that continued long beyond the threat of the Spanish Armada. And I was hoping you might say a few words about that.
Well, I can. And of course, it does remind me that there is one other very famous Hardy that I haven't mentioned that Patricia knows. So on one of these very high hilltop overlooking Weymouth is a statue to Admiral Hardy, Admiral Masterman Hardy. And he was the Hardy of Nelson fame. Remember Kiss Me Hardy when Nelson was on his deathbed? And Admiral Hardy was his vice admiral. And there's a wonderful statue uh, beacon on top of this hill. And that is one of the hills where beacons have been lit ever since you mentioned Gordon, right along the south coast. It was from Plymouth right along to Dover, actually. And they have been used throughout history, but most recently they've been used as a celebration. For example, the royal jubilees, royal weddings, and people have lit bonfires one to the other all the way along these wonderful hilltops. So yes, you're quite right, and there is one very close to here, and there's a statue there of the third quite famous Hardy that I wanted to mention. Thank you, Gordon.
I don't think our audience would know about Kiss Me Hardy. I don't know how much British history is taught in American schools, but tell us that story because it fascinated me when you took me there.
Well, I'm sure everybody will have heard of the Battle of Trafalgar and our Admiral Nelson, who won a great victory but was mortally wounded in that battle. And the story is, as he was on his deathbed below decks on his ship, um, he pulled Admiral Hardy down to him and said, "Kiss me, Hardy." Some scholars think that instead of kiss me, it's kismet, and kismet means that's fate. So did he say that's fate, Hardy, or did he say kiss me, Hardy? But colloquially, we have always known it as kiss me, Hardy. But that is the great naval admiral who was number two to Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar.
Wonderful. Janelle Barlow. Okay, unmute Janelle.
There we go. There we go. This is wonderful. The history to experience in England whenever I've been there is just, I mean, I get moved to a different place. And so I'm thinking that where I live now in New Mexico, it's a new state, new history, except that if you go to the White Sands National Park, there are footprints in the sand. If none of you, if you've not been to the White Sands, you should put that on your bucket list. And there are footprints of a mother with their daughter that's what they've ascertained, that they were the mother and the daughter walking along. And those footprints are somewhere between 21 and 23,000 years old. You know, so we have history in this country too. We just typically don't pay much attention to it. We it's like an artifact rather than anything that was real. But a mother and her daughter walked in that area 23,000 years ago. And I'm wondering, when you're doing the work that you've been doing, does it impact you? Does it pull you back into that experience? Because I think that's what history has the capacity to do.
I just love social history, Janelle, and I like to picture how people were living at the period we are studying or researching. So it's all very well knowing dates and on such and such there was a battle or blah blah blah. I'm much keener on understanding how they lived, what they wore, what they ate, how they behaved, the social part at that time. To be honest, Janelle, I cannot comprehend 20 odd thousand years ago. I can't comprehend umpteen million years ago in the sky when we look above our heads. I I can't comprehend it. I can comprehend 400 years ago and being in the shoes of somebody sailing a ship. That's probably just me, and there will be people who are far more interested in going back to prehistory and what happened. But it's a wonderful world we live in, and I believe God created it all. How and why, I don't know. I wonder. I just think it's amazing.
Well,
Oh,
23,000 years ago, some woman took the hand of her daughter and walked. I don't know what the geography looked like at that point, but they walked through the sand and left their footprints, which is something that somebody contemporaneously would do as well, a mother and their daughter. It's a great feeling of connection to the world.
do you have a YouTube channel? I noticed there are a lot of wonderful history preserving YouTube channels that I've enjoyed. Like Shadiversity, and showing like authentic medieval fighting or medieval bow work, and there's one historical preservation society that where a group of people are living in 1461, spending a week,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
living real life in that
yeah,
time and place.
yeah. Thank you, Colin. The answer is not at the moment. What we are hoping to do, and we're talking to a TV production company actually, is once we have certainty over its new home, let's hope, for example, it's Weymouth Museum, and they have already identified the space where they would like it to go on prominent display. We then want to engage a production company. We need to raise a little bit of money to make a film of the history, starting with probably the explosion on the San Salvador in
Mm.
the Armada and taking us right through the journey until it ends up in the museum that we hope. So we are actively thinking about a TV documentary, and then
Oh,
there will be
great.
a lot of research that will flow from that.
One suggestion with the documentary, because the thing I've noticed with some documentaries is that the background music tends to be like, oh, we'll just throw in this like generic documentary music, when there are so many like early music ensembles in the world today. And again, you can check these out on YouTube. And so it'd be wonderful when you have your documentary to like bring in one of these wonderful early music ensembles to play, to have the background music be like the authentic music of the period
Yeah,
backing the
good,
documentary rather than a generic score.
sure, good idea. I mean, I guess we will be working alongside the production company. They will have their own ideas, and if they're going to spend the money, but that's a great conversation to have. Thank you.
Mhm.
Hugh Coppin?
Really interesting talk, Godfrey. Thank you. But one thing which probably displays my ignorance in that, why is it called a screen?
Ah, that's a very good question. It wouldn't have been called a screen on the San Salvador. They were essentially oak timbers, as I said, going across the width of the after castle. Um, it was called a screen when it was introduced into the school building by that headmaster, Robert Cheek. He just thought it was a fine piece of history to display in his school. And I think it's simply screened a wall or screened it off from another room. So there's nothing technical about it. It's just when I remember actually it being in the library in school, remember there were two doors to it. Uh, One door led into a little stationery cupboard, and there was very often a master in there, unbeknownst to us, listening to us, pretending to work in the library. Every so often he would open the door and pop out. Um, but it was therefore just a practical screening off or partitioning one room or hiding a wall or something. So I don't think there's anything technical about that.
Thanks.
If we go back to Queen Elizabeth, because I attended Queen Elizabeth's grammar school in Wimborne. In fact, I was the second year that they let in girls. So for all those decades it was just boys. Queen Elizabeth was so well educated at this point in the story when she was queen. Were the kings that went before her as well educated as she was?
I'm not sufficiently qualified to say yay or nay. Um, and certainly Henry VIII was, I think, from my knowledge, could speak a couple of European languages. But Elizabeth, because she had a lot of time on her own as a young girl, she certainly uh, was a scholar of some note. And as I say, Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Spanish, and very interested in literature, the arts. Um, I think she was one of our greatest ever monarchs, if not the greatest, because there was no parliament debating. She was the one who made decisions at that point, remember? So it was up to her really what happened, and she had to control those courtiers around her, um, head of the treasury and so on. And she fought off, our enemies. So she was in battle, not personally, but she had to send troops into war as well as having this wonderful education. So I can't answer you really, Patricia, but I think she was probably one of the best.
Good. Well, I'm very happy to hear that. Derek Arden, I'm glad you joined us. I forgot to tell Godfrey and you that we changed our clocks. Even I didn't even know we changed our clocks till I was in the conference and they said, don't forget tonight.
I was having my little after lunch siesta and a cup of tea, and the phone went, and I thought that's a bit early. But Derek, I still made it on time.
Well,
Good.
you made it on time. I didn't, Godfrey, but our American friends changing the clocks, not telling us what's going on. 1 minute there's tariffs on somebody, there's tariffs not on other people. I'm totally confused. Perhaps someone can keep me up to date on what's going on. Anyway, nice to see everybody. And I'm sorry I missed your presentation, Godfrey. I was really looking forward to that. But there we
sure
go.
you can catch it on YouTube, I'm sure.
No, I'm looking forward to it. Nice to see
Derek,
everybody.
Derek, we're actually turning the clocks back by 30 years, but it was just this 1 hour that got you fooled.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Do we have any more questions for Godfrey? All right, putting your hands up. Otherwise, because I have a tendency to hog the show, which I don't want to if somebody else has another question. All right. Tell us, although this was not the subject, about you had your investigation company long before the internet. Isn't that correct? Or did you have technology?
Yes. We started our company in 1995, and there wasn't much technology around then. Mobile phones, if you had one, were the proverbial brick. So there was probably far more legwork and street work required than there would be today. And I'm often asked what would have made the biggest difference. The biggest single difference would have been sat nav, because if we were trying to find somebody or find an asset, uh, it was balancing an atlas in your left hand and driving with your right hand, wondering where to go. Whereas, of course, today you could plug it into SatNav. And in fact, if you were going to 2 or 3 addresses, you could plug it in 1, 2, 3, 4, and SatNav would just take you there. Would have been so much easier. There were databases that we could access, but it's much easier today. I do remember very early in the 2000s, I suppose, we worked with a company close to where our head office was, who amazed us because even then they could interrogate a computer or mobile phone anywhere in the world from their mobile phone. So that digital aspect of interrogation was there 20 years ago. And now, of course, we're all worried about this sort of thing and who's watching who's listening to who. So there were some huge differences, but a lot of it was much more manual and foot slog, going and knocking on doors. Wow. And even today, and Derek's here, I know, but we wear our banking hats. We would say in investigation, never assume, never trust the balance sheet. If the balance sheet says I've got 30 lorries on the books, how do you know? You've got to go and count them. Companies House doesn't do it for you. So never assume what the balance sheet says. You've got to go and check. And that is good old fashioned eyes and ears on the ground. And that hasn't changed, but there are databases to help you today.
You have spent so much time and energy with the great oak screen, and when you finally have it in its resting place, the world can come see it. What will you do next? Will you go on another mission, or will you just sit back and drink tea and doze and go out with Derek and educate him about some of the places he wouldn't know?
That's I suppose that's a good question. Although, Patricia, you probably know I have a lot of other interests as well. And if this one comes to a happy conclusion, I'll be still kept very busy doing the other things that I do today.
Such as?
Well, I love to see young people reach their potential. So I'm very involved in education locally, and I'm part of the governance that looks after 13 schools in the area. So we have about 7,000 students, a budget of 50 million, and it's just nice to be involved in helping these young people at school do their best. So that's one big interest. And the other interest, I'm sure you will know the worldwide organization, the YMCA. And there's a big branch in Dorchester that I have the privilege of being president there. And we look after 500 young people every week who come through our doors. Again, totally inclusive, from physically disabled, mentally challenged, and we help them have a bit of fun and keep them off the streets and provide a nice facility for them. So those are two of the big things I do, as well as involved in the local village, and I'm church warden at our local church, and so on and so on. So I'm pretty busy, Patricia.
Good. And tell us how many people live in your village.
Oh yeah, I could name them all. There are 70 houses and 150 people. We have a wonderful pub that's essential in an English village, the church, which is quite well supported, and a village hall where there are activities all the time. I play table tennis up there, and we have a lot of fun. But yeah, it's a tiny little village in not far from Dorchester. It's 10. You saw the map of Dorchester. It's 10 miles to the west of Dorchester.
Good. Now, this is a test for our American members. All right. Samuel Harwood Bowles is the gentleman who was in charge of the restoration, because in England, although they are getting more difficult to find, we still have a few great craftsmen that their skill comes from generation to generation. Isn't that correct, Godfrey?
Oh, absolutely, and he's very well regarded. Yeah.
Now, what is it about his name that rings a bell for our American friends. Well, all right.
Sally
Well,
Bowles.
Sally Bowles? No, I think Carl Walsh, you know the answer.
Is he related to Queen Camilla by any chance?
Yes, he is, Carl.
Yes.
Yes.
I like my answer
However, you
better.
said he doesn't really advertise that.
Yeah.
No, he doesn't. He's a very modest chap, lovely guy, top of his game. But yes, he does have that royal connection. Yeah.
Yeah. So you heard it here first. Good. I'm glad Carl managed to certainly answer that question. So with that, if there are no more questions of Godfrey, or I don't know, some of our members and Peter Winkler, thank you very much for joining us, and our members who came in later. Any other questions? If not, I will ask Godfrey if he has any closing remarks.
I've got one question for you, actually, which was completely off-piste. I came to San Francisco first in 1982, leading a field hockey team, and we played an international tournament in Canada. We then came down to San Francisco and we stayed in the University of Berkeley. And I remember going to a restaurant, and I wonder if it's still going. I think it was quite notorious at its time. It was called Houlihan's down on the waterfront.
I
Oh,
don't know if it's still going.
Susan's laughing. Is it still there?
I don't know. Boy, do I remember Houlihan's.
Well, there's a lot of Houlihan's all over. I don't know if it's the same one chain or something.
Okay.
They closed or something, but
Well, it was a fun time, and we had a great time. I can picture Sausalito and Chinatown, and there was an earthquake while we were there as well. I think it was about 4 or 5 on the scale. But we felt that.
So you really felt this is the Californian San Francisco experience.
Yeah.
Houlihan's and an earthquake.
And I think if you're being sensible for a moment, Patricia, we've learnt a couple of lessons from this whole experience, and it's a lesson for the school as well. I mean, we, the alumni, we're the good guys, really, trying to put right what went wrong. But this screen was not on the school's asset register. I think if it had been, there would have been more questions asked at the beginning. I mean, they had all their computers and gym equipment and desks and chairs and so on and so on, but they didn't have this wonderful bit of history on their asset register. So that was a lesson. And then the other lesson is, how on earth do you insure it? What is the value? Unknown. But we have to have some insurance. So we've taken the decision that it's priceless, but we will insure it for the money we have spent on it and the money we plan to spend on it. So if it goes, it goes. It can never be replaced, but at least we'll be reimbursed for any outlay that we have. So those, I guess, are the 2 business lessons from this journey.
What does the British Museum do with all their artifacts?
No idea.
Yeah, I mean, how much is the Ishtar Gate worth? How much is the Rosetta Stone worth?
I don't think they're insurable, Carl. I think they just
probably not.
Take them on the head. There's probably fire insurance up to a certain amount, and then you're on your own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, another Dorset character, Michael Legg, was a 3rd generation antique dealer who was one of my brother's very best friends. A wonderful Dorset character. And he knew so much about furniture that the Victoria and Albert Museum would invite him up to lecture on what they had and was it really what they thought it was. And a lot of what we might call muckety muck families who now they're giving their homes to the National Trust because they can't afford to keep them up. But over the centuries, there have been times when they've had good times and hard times, and many of them tell stories about the furniture they own. Well, over the years, they've had them replicated so they can sell the original. And they, of course, Michael could never tell you who he worked with, but he would be invited and he would tell them exactly what they had. And he would say, no, that chest is not original, because the way they connect and slot everything, that wasn't invented for another 100 years after you think this is what you have. So there are, but a lot of these great experts are dying off because, of course, it costs so much more to have a real artisan work for you.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I would say, yeah, it's, again, on the micro level, I'm finding it's really fun also seeing a lot of younger people playing period instruments or engaging in like historical activities. I've been seeing more and more of that on YouTube. So it's like on a macro level, it may look very, very hopeless, but on a micro level, there's this thriving environment of historical preservation going on. I'll send a YouTube link to something.
Yeah, imagine what it took to round up the people to restore Notre Dame, for instance.
Yes. Yes. Good. So with that, thank you so much, Godfrey. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Derek, for popping in from England. I will see you very soon. We can start working on my itinerary for my trip to Dorset. And wonderful people, I will see you all next week when we are listening to Karen Gibson, as I will be in Las Vegas. Carl, if you can run the meeting for us, and I will introduce and interview our guest. So with that, wonderful people, make sure you have RSVP'd for our big spectacular event, which is on April the 16th, and a request from your president. We will have the song for birthdays. That is my birthday on the 18th of April. So part of this I consider my birthday celebration. So with that, wonderful friends,
Thank you, everybody.
Again,
Lovely
Thank
to
you,
be with you.
Godfrey.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Carl, for all your help.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.